What's up, y'all? Welcome to the fuck. We don't have a fucking name for this podcast yet, but hi, I'm Paolo. I go by he/him pronouns. Go, JR, would you like to introduce yourself?
I mean, you kind of did it for me, but hello, my name is JR. I use he, him, they, them pronouns. We don't have a name for this podcast yet, but essentially, what we're going to be doing is going through Avatar the Last. Man, we're going through Avatar the Last Airbender, and we're going through episode by episode. And basically, what we're going to be doing is looking at it through an ethnic studies critical lens and seeing what themes we noticed, what like just happens to be laid out in front of us, both for the overarching narrative as well as like just as critical concepts in ethnic studies that we're aware of. So not only is this going to be like your standard review type of podcast and dissection podcast, it's also going to be kind of educational one because we'll be talking about a bunch of stuff.
We're gonna do our absolute best to try to talk about these like big ethnic studies concepts. I know that some of y'all be thinking ethnic studies, so it's like a free ethnic studies class. Well, yeah, basically. But yeah, just like my friend JR mentioned, we're gonna like really delve into it. It's gonna be very loose, and of course, I'm hoping in the future we get questions and we get guests to come here. You know, friends really. I mean, I say guests, but more of like just people we know to just talk about the podcast. So as with all things, we are gonna go into the first episode of Avatar and understanding that it's cause, um, well, I guess to I don't even know where to start with the first episode because I think what we discussed beforehand was that the first episode, as for audio slash video listeners who are aware, the first episode of Avatar was kind of an anomaly in the West in the sense that like, you know, we are used to this style of cartoon where things are very exaggerated. We're not used to, I guess you could say, superhumanistic proportions. Some would even call Avatar now. They would call it like an anime inspired art style. But you know, like I guess let's rewind back to like 2005 February,
Yeah, yeah.
the first episode of Avatar. Thank you for the fact check, Jr. Appreciate that. Yeah, like what we wanted to discuss right now is like the impact that had on like a Western cartoon audience. Because I guess full bias, by the way, y'all. For those listening in, I am immersed in in anime, a weeb, if you will. So for me, it's like, oh, this is weird. It looks like anime. But it doesn't sound like anime. You know, the lips were fucking synced.
They it looks like it matches up perfectly. Um, no, yeah. So episode one, book one. I'm said book one air. That's Korra. Book one water. With episode one, the boy in the iceberg. It starts. Oh man, if I remember correctly, it starts with Katara. I mean, other than like after the intro and all of that, it starts with Katara and Sokka on the boat, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sokka being sexist.
Being fucking sexist as shit. Katara actually using like her waterbending powers like out of nowhere. Or
Yeah,
okay, not
trying
out of
trying to
nowhere.
trying to what's the word I'm looking for? Progress her waterbending skills.
Yeah, trying to learn and like already from the get go. Well, I remember the intro already was. I know it's super iconic for all of us who grew up with the show and even those who are now getting into Avatar because of Netflix. Um, but you know the intro for the show, like right before the Katara and Sokka actually find the iceberg and whatnot, it does a really interesting thing for world building in that like it's rare that a show does this successfully in that it reminds you that hey, this thing kind of happened before, so we're living in this aftermath of these world events, and if we have to really like go into it, um, Jerry, help me out here.
Well, I mean, no, you're right because I feel like I can't. I feel like I can't even remember a lot of shows. Well, also it was 2005, so we were pretty young, but I can't remember a lot of shows before Avatar having like their intro be also the narration and kind of like I mean they did have a previously on Avatar every now and then. But I can't remember any other like TV show, cartoon, anime, whatever having an opening like Avatar where it's like, we talk about the four elements and we talk about how the Fire Nation attacks, right? And then, of course, in the very first episode, you get this extended intro where you talk about how everyone did used to live in harmony, and we talk a little bit more in depth about the Avatar. But you come into each and every episode after thinking or listening to this, and you don't. I can't even think of another one other than another Avatar series to do something like this, where you start with just the world building before you even meet any of the characters
Yo, Jay,
properly.
are you actually ready?
What do you
Are
mean?
you ready?
Oh,
I
you're gonna?
know,
Yeah, yeah,
I
go
know
ahead.
one. Another show that did this really well, that framed it in such a way that, because I think to continue to segue into this point real quick, what was really unique about the Avatar intro, that very famous monologue from Katara, is not only does it set up the perspective of which the story is going to be told from, like you can tell it's going to be told from his kids, because the first episode has the extended monologue where she's like, "My grandmother told me," and from that moment you knew, so this is going to be told from the perspective of the future generation, like the modern day, so to speak. But another cartoon actually in the West that did this really well, that I glossed over. What the fuck am I? The Samurai Jack.
Oh
Long
my
ago
God.
in the distant
Yeah.
land.
Yeah,
So
you're right. You're right. And it's Aku narrating. Funny enough, also voiced by Mako.
yeah, shout out to Mako. May he rest in peace. The voice of Aku and Iroh, which was
Yes. The
like,
original Iroh.
yeah, and we were like, honestly, like when I found out who Mako was, I was blown away. Like Avatar actually had a pretty star-studded cast.
Yeah,
Mark
amazing cast.
Hamill was the Fire Lord.
You got Dante Bosco from the debut and
Yeah,
Hook.
shout out to Dante Bosco, American Dragon, Jake Long. Let's
Oh yeah, there's
go.
American Dragon Jake Long as well. I forgot about that.
Yeah, but like again, it's just really. I think it would be safe to say too that like Avatar kind of, because oh man, like I guess to briefly talk about it, I know we're talking about Avatar, but Samurai Jack kind of did, kind of, it was like proof of concept. Well, also it was like it was popular in its own right, but it was proof that there could be this more like adult approach to cartoons that weren't always like slapstick comedy. Like there, it was still lighthearted, but you could very much tell an engaging story underneath it all. And I think Avatar just kind of continued that really. But the biggest difference here is that, and I think this was also in par two with like a lot of anime that was popular at the time. And for those early thousand anime fans, like for us it was Naruto.
There's a bunch of
Um,
shonen anime. You got
yeah,
Naruto,
Dragon Ball Z was like,
Dragon Ball Z. One Piece was starting to come out in the States, I think, at around the same time,
yeah, and
if I
all
remember
of,
correctly.
yeah, I think so too. Like in the Toonami era, and all of these in kind of they with Avatar, like they had this commonality that like, oh, they were all like in their, like they were like 12-ish. Like I think Naruto, I remember like obsessing as a kid over like how old Naruto was because I wanted to make that connection so badly. But
Yeah,
I
Naruto was
think,
young when he started.
I believe, yeah, he was 12 too, just like with Aang. And I think that's the coolest part about this whole series is that like, for once, like in comparison to Samurai Jack was still was a cartoon, yes, but its main protagonist was at least in his 20s. Like
Yeah,
I remember he was being a lot older, but
Jack was at least a young adult.
and then we have Aang here, who's very much like he's 13 or 12, not even 13. Like this, well, technically 112. But again, like what's really interesting about like this impact is like, oh, like it's kind of bringing all those like shonen concepts that we see in like anime of like, young-ish boy has to fight against like society, but it kind of does this in like a very slow-paced way. I think we meet Aang pretty early on, but even then we don't see Aang for a while. We actually see like there's the opening narration, and then there's Katara and Sokka, so we can kind of like see this. And also like what a big thing to have, like you're like the first characters that you see, I think, no, you don't see, actually you don't even see Zuko in them till later. Like
No, you don't see them until I think halfway. You don't see them until Aang comes out,
yeah, and
because then we have that whole line with Zuko going, oh,
yeah,
it's something along the lines like, oh,
yeah,
that's
it's
a
like,
huge power surge. It must be him.
and then you got Mako would be like, shut the fuck up, Nick. I want this drink, but damn,
Give me my tea. Let me finish my roast duck.
yeah, god damn it, just cook this. But I think it was really interesting too, like especially as like a kid of color, like I'm not the brownest Filipino out there, but I'm definitely on the brown side. But like just seeing like the two main characters like not pale,
Yeah, no, and we're
like
looking at people who look like, speaking, I'm talking about people, I'm talking specifically Katara and Sokka in the first scene that's set up. You see them, they're dressed in like, if I remember correctly, Michael DiMartino and Brian Kinetsko based them off the Inuit tribe.
Yeah, they did.
So you see them in like, they're in their traditional outfits and they're brown,
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's you don't, or at least for me, I feel like I didn't really see that a lot growing up. I feel like a lot of even the shonen protagonists who, if you go off the logic of it's an anime, so therefore the characters are Japanese unless stated otherwise.
Yeah,
Um, you don't really see a bunch like like Naruto's pretty pale, Ichigo's pretty pale,
yeah.
Luffy's pretty pale.
I think like I think with Ichigo though, like he well, to be fair with Bleach, they hit the representation mark a little bit harder though because they had Chad. Yeah, for all of you who remember Chad, my my Puerto Rican boy, and he even has like this whole Puerto Rican backstory, and that shit was sick. But he was like the to be fair though, he did like okay, well, it can be like perceived as a little bit of I guess you could say a little offensive that he's like the strong stoic quiet type, but then again like it but then again it does serve some comedic moments where he's like you think he'd be the serious one but like he goes off with Ichigo's antics.
Yeah, he
But
just makes a joke.
yeah, or it's just like he just goes along with it because they're like best friends or whatever. But yeah, like I guess on because the thing is too, it's like on that end it's more of well yeah okay. To be fair, as a kid I was cognizant enough to be like I am clearly some sort of Asian. I don't know what Filipino looks like just yet, but Asian's a wide enough net to at least identify with at the time.
Yeah.
So the shonen protagonists for me were always like, oh hey, but here are like Asian protagonists. Like Naruto was very definitely Japanese in a sense, because like
I mean, you didn't
his
see his eyes until like
yeah,
until he went out to the Zabuza arc.
I know. I think for me it was like the village though. Like I was already catching on to like oh like how is this culturally influenced by other cultures and like oh
Yeah.
like Leaf
Speaking
Village.
yeah, speaking about cultural influences, circling back around to episode one, like
Hell yeah.
just I think even like when you the shots we have whenever we're with the I say the Fire Nation, I really just mean Zuko and Iroh right now.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you see a lot of like you physically see a lot of that like Asian influence, based off what they're eating. Iroh drinks a bunch of tea.
Mm-hmm.
Even the musical score and all of it, you hear an amazing like score written that has Asian influences, and then we cut back and we see Aang, Katara, and Sokka now back in the Southern Water Tribe village, and it's a small community. It's like
Mm-hmm.
they take care of their elders. All the men went off to go fight in the 100-Year War. It's it's something that I could see like very well, especially if we're looking at it like in as like indigenous type of thing. If we're looking at indigeneity, like even though I do understand that there are more than just those two genders under different types of indigenous tribes and such. If we unfortunately have to look at it through the binary of male female, then this makes sense.
Yeah. And that's the thing too. It's like I know that if we ever get to Korra, because to be fair, we have 3 seasons to talk about, each
Yeah.
averaging about 20 episodes, and then there are the specials, and then of course everyone's favorite episode, the Tales of Bossing Say. There's like a crap ton.
Yeah, which is like
Yeah,
what, 4 episodes in one episode.
fucking, and they're told so well. Um, yeah, like I guess what I was like, like again going to yeah, like I think the reason why I brought up the whole seeing again brown characters for the first time is I understand that of course, yes, nowadays we will always be able to say like, hey, they started it, but they didn't probably do the best because they Qatar. Well, it's interesting that you bring up gender roles because without I guess the acknowledgement of the gender roles, because I know that it doesn't also represent how a lot of indigenous tribes are because like if anything gender roles is very much like a western kind of like more americanized idea.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, like a lot of indigenous tribes and indigenous folk, they just had roles to help the thriving of their community rather.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always limited by gender. But what's interesting is that like uh even with that, it like the first like major or the first joke that Katara pulls was her going off on her brother, and I thought like again it's just really interesting to have these brown characters and then basically the female brown character empower herself, say like, hey yo, you're even though you're my brother, I have to fucking clean your laundry and shit. Like that was just, I know
Yeah.
that's like the first joke of the series, quote unquote, but like the way that that's brought up is like it's just I don't know, it was so naturally brought up, and I will always love like that's one of the many things about the first episode that I liked.
No, yeah, I think like even in that rant, I know we're jumping all around the timeline of episode one right now, but I know
Mm-hmm.
even in that small rant that Katara gives Sokka before they find Aang is, um, she says, I can't remember if she says misogynistic, sexist, or both.
She says she goes down the list.
I know she goes down a list, but I don't remember
Yeah.
which specific words she said or if she said both. But like as a kid, like as someone who in 2005 was shit, actually I don't know how old I was in 2005. I was so I graduated in elementary school in 2008, 2005. So it's just I was in second grade. How old are you in second grade? Like
Frick. I'm like thinking about myself right now.
my nephew's 6. So I was like what 7 or 8.
I am probably around that age range too. I cannot do math right now.
Yeah, like I was probably 7 or 8 watching this, and like that entire segment of Katara calling her brother out on his bullshit, essentially on being a misogynistic sexist.
Yeah.
Like, as a kid, you don't think about stuff like that.
Yeah.
Usually, like 2005, you definitely weren't thinking about stuff like that, and you wouldn't even know what those words
Mm-hmm.
meant. But like, they planted seeds very early on, and like, yo, this is gonna be Sokka's story arc from going from
Mm-hmm.
a stubborn, misogynistic, sexist asshole who thinks that men can do everything better than women to like a super empathetic, funny guy who's super smart.
Yeah, and I think with like to that scene too, like the reason why I bring it up is because like yeah, like we're gonna see like probably in the future, and we see it a lot too. There are a lot of little moments like that where Avatar takes its time to like plant these seeds of like, hey, we're gonna like really break this down later on, because like yeah, like and everything kind of naturally unfolds because like now we've gone to the intro where we understand that like we're going to be looking at this story from the perspective of kids who are basically dealing with the aftermath of the 100-year war, where basically the Avatar is missing for these hundreds of years. So the Fire Nation is like they decide to bull out, and they're like, all right, we're gonna act a little wild here, and they wild out in the worst way possible, and
So we gonna be
everybody's like,
colonizers.
yeah, fuck. They said, hold up. We read this book, Christopher Columbus. Nah, fuck you. No, you. But like they did that shit, and then everybody's like, oh no, we're kind of underneath the like not rule of the Fire Nation, but everything's very heavily policed. You know, where it's one of those things where it's almost like a Big Brother scenario where it's like if they know they do something out of line with the Fire Nation, then like at any moment, the Fire Nation will end up on their shores type deal. And yeah, like it just everything again like naturally flows into this like thing of like every single thing that that Sokka and Katara like do from that moment on after again the setup, it kind of it flows naturally, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And
Yeah,
that like to see again all these characters like, oh shit, like we kind of have an idea of like who they are, why they're important, and then the hits of like, oh shit, everything kind of falls into place. When Katara actually uses her rage to kind of fuel her water bending, which is again like I'm thinking way in the future to be fair, but it's interesting that this idea of your emotions impacting your bending, how that gets like expanded even more. But
mm.
we'll get
Hmm.
to that. We'll get to that.
We're already kind of talking about setup, and it's like episode one. I'm trying to remember where it ends now, but I can't remember if episode one like does do Anka and Katara actually end up going to the ship in episode one? Like, does Zuko
Yeah,
capture
the
Aang in the
end
first episode? I
the
can't
end of
remember.
episode one, I do believe. I think it ends with Aang's capture because I guess to summarize the episode real quick, and I'm gonna go off of memory. So we have the intro that tells us about what happened to the Avatar, the state of the world is in, and basically, I guess for those who are uninitiated, if you're listening to this podcast for the first time, and also just new to the world of Avatar for the first time, first off, go watch it. Do yourself a favor. Um,
It's an
watch.
amazing show. It's on Netflix again.
Yeah, and I understand that people are like, oh well, the animation is old. I honestly recently just saw it, the first episode with a partner, and
It holds up.
the
It
animation is
does not
pretty.
look old.
Yeah, like the animation is actually really good, and with the HD like stuff that it has, yeah. So there's that world building that sets up like the current state that the world is in. The Avatar, which is this basically master of the four elements of air, fire, water, and earth. They vanished, and the world is without this Avatar person. And basically, the Avatars, think of them as like they keep the world in balance because they are the only person in this universe to be able to control all four elements and kind of be connected to them. So
Yes.
yes,
Also, just to fact check myself earlier, I was
yeah.
scrubbing through episode one right now on Netflix. Actually, episode one ends with Katara and Aang leaving the Fire Navy ship and Zuko finding them. Like we don't actually see Zuko capture Aang until I think the beginning of episode two.
Interesting. Yeah.
So episode one's episode end. Oh no, excuse me. Episode one ends. There we go. With Aang and Katara jumping out of that Fire Navy ship and Zuko going, "I found him finally."
That
The
is.
Avatar.
Yeah, I remember that now. Fuck yeah. That was
Like
so.
looking through his telescope. Shit.
Yeah, that was good. That was such a good ending too. Because like I think at the same time too, what this does in terms of setting up, and again, it's like really interesting in terms of like kind of to also meld our discussion earlier about like what Avatar, like how it kind of impacts the state of Western cartoons, is that like where Samurai Jack's journey back to defeat Aku was very episodic, and it did benefit the show because he was in a the context, at least the world could be built within these little episodes type of thing. What's interesting now is now you have a show where it ends on a cliffhanger to basically say, hey, there really is a bigger story here. We're not doing like an episodic thing. And I understand that there are some episodes that do take a break, but the world of Avatar kind of introduced this idea to that, like, yeah, there is a bigger story, and let's not forget it.
No, yeah,
um
absolutely.
and typically you wouldn't see those things until you hit like comic books or like I guess you could say I want to say more mature titles, but of course that's even
Yeah,
that's like
actually, I
loose.
was gonna say the same thing. The more mature stuff,
Yeah,
like the teenage stuff, or because this is the target audience was kids, and it hit,
yeah,
but it also hit an audience that had, um, I think they knew they were trying to hit, but didn't think they would.
and that's
You
like
know?
the big plus about animation is that like I think that's why people compare it to anime a lot too, is because anime is also like it's quote unquote for kids, but like it's meant to, but really it's not just a matter of it's for kids, but like I think that really comes from this idea. Well, it's been dumbed down from the idea of it being accessible because it's
Yeah,
cartoons. Anyone can watch it, and that means anyone can get into it. But throughout time, that kind of eventually became this whole like, oh well, that means they're really simple. But it's
yeah.
clear that in this one episode, we get um we get themes of like colonias, like fuck, I can't say the word sometimes.
You
Colonialization.
Yes, you already get themes of colonialism and colonization just from the intro, because you see that
hmm
the Fire Nation is taking over. We see a connection to more indigenous like lifestyle, and more indigenous like practices due to like the Southern Water Tribe being
hmm
as small as they are, and you kind of see like what it's like living with them because Aang, they bring back Aang to their tribe. We meet a fun-loving personality
Yeah,
through Aang that like is a good foil, but in the relationship between Sokka and Katara in the first book because they always argue.
yeah, like you finally have that one person, and like I know it's like really typical to have like especially in anime, to have the protagonist be very like fun loving and childish. But then again, considering again too, because I believe in this episode too is where we get the first flashback of why Aang left the monk monastery. We get just a very like quick glimpse of it.
I'm scrubbing through the episode. Let me
Yeah, he like I
I'll let you
believe
know.
it comes to him like in a dream or something. Um,
Oh, you're
but
right. We do get a quick one.
yeah, like it's like very brief, but like even then, like that was like a pretty a dark thing for me as a kid, because it's like in Aang's flashback, you see him like basically in like a thunderstorm, so it's clear that something bad is happening. And like even the tone too was like it was dark enough for it to be palatable though for like a child's mind. Like
Oh
it
yeah,
wasn't like it was. I can of course I understand that there are people who are a bit more sensitive to imagery like that, but it communicated its message without Aang being like bloodied up or something like that.
yeah, and
Um,
like it was also literally dark enough. Like they
hmm
changed the shading of the entire screen to show you that one, it was a flashback, and two, that shit's going down.
yeah, like
Like it's raining, it's a thunderstorm. You know?
yeah, like it does a really good job like in terms of story setup to again bring it back to this idea that like these things can exist within the realm of like a child's cartoon, but like they push it enough so that Avatar becomes its own thing. Because obviously, you wouldn't even be talking about it now if if not for the fact that like it really tried to separate itself and have its own identity. Because at the end of the day, like there's always the you can always make the argument that Avatar: The Last Airbender was an allegory for growing up and for dealing with um in this case your actual generational past, which is actually something we can talk about in the future when we actually maybe get to the ending of the series. But what it does set up now is that like, hey, there's this kid and he's dealing with things, but also like if you think about it in like real life, it's like, hey, it's basically saying that like not all these kids in these cartoons, because like Timmy had his Fairly Odd Parents, Danny Phantom had ghost powers and a pretty like loving family, like
Also, he
I
was a
know.
teenager.
Yeah, like a teenager too, but like but like Danny Phantom was like in high school, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah,
No,
yeah.
yeah. Casper High.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Casper, holy shit. um but we have Aang here who like, I mean, well, granted, it is also like his culture and stuff. Like he comes from like a monk monastery. That's like more future stuff, but for context, we kind of have a kid who doesn't have like a traditional family in that sense. Like his family's basically like the friends that he makes on the way. The first being, of course, Katara and Sokka. But yeah, it's just, I don't know. Like I always will love like the way that the first episode is set up. Like yes, there are some pretty basic things that it does. Like there are moments of slapstick comedy that were honestly even
Yeah,
to this day it was
penguin sledding.
fucking penguin sledding. The whole like Sokka's fort, that shit was hilarious.
Yeah, no.
Um,
The first episode has like a bunch of great hooks, and another theme that just crossed my mind. Like it already shows you like the effects of war.
mm-hmm.
You know, and the effects that it has on like families and tribes and people. Because well, one for Aang, you know. Also, spoiler alert if you haven't seen the first episode of Avatar, but also it's subtitled The Last Airbender, so surprise, he's the last
I
Airbender.
know, like, oh, ooh.
Um, but it's like, you know, we see this literal kid who now has the entire responsibility thrusted upon him to, you need to save the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you need to bring balance to the four nations again. Or I guess three, because one of them doesn't technically exist anymore.
Yeah, and ooh, bit of a spoiler, but I think at this point, like, I think full disclosure too. I know that we
It
probably
is
shouldn't.
not a bit of a spoiler. The subtitle is The Last
Yeah,
Avatar,
the
or The
last
Last Airbender.
Airbender. Yeah, and it's like, oh hey, who was the first Airbender we meet? And that's another thing that, like, again, like this, like, I know we keep talking about setup, but like, I think what I just that's kind of why it's so important to talk about like how a first episode does it, because like, I think what I'm trying, like, what I want. What I realize about like what makes a good like first episode is how much information do you tell the audience within like your first, again, 20 minutes too. Like, we see
Yeah.
like a lot of like modern like live action TV shows can last for an hour, but like I'm gonna be real, sometimes they lose my attention within that hour because of, well, commercial breaks, but also because of how much more talking there goes on. And yes, I understand that when you have 20 minutes you have that constraint of, okay, how do we show all of this? But I think there's a beauty in that constraint, especially with animation, that you can start focusing on expressions of characters a bit more. You can also start focusing on things that are like a lot more visually like storytelling. um that I think that's why the first episode is so good, because in addition to because we basically have our, what we like to say, a text bomb of information. Like, most of y'all will know this as exposition in the first monologue that Katara goes through. A long time ago, there's a Fire Nation, there's the Avatar, and blah 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 blah. But with that context, it, like, without it, like, I would, if for all of you who already have seen the first episode, it doesn't give the events of the first episode that much weight. Like if we were told at the end, it would serve more of an explanation to as to why there's so much tension rather than a, oh, here's the reason why these events are important, why it was important that in this isolated tribe. Because another thing too that's really interesting about the setup is that like out of all the people that could have found the Avatar, it could have taken place in other tribes, but we are given the snapshot of like, but it just had to happen to one small little water tribe where the community is very tight knit already, where the majority of their tribe has left to fight in the war, and it's one of those like blessing in disguise. It's like a blessing and a curse, not blessing in disguise, but like a blessing and a curse type of thing, because it's like, yes, they find the Avatar, the person who was missing for 100 years, to bring balance to the world, but at what cost type of thing. And yeah, like the first episode does this so beautifully because it's like, oh, not like no one's dying or anything like that, but it's like you kind of get it, you know?
Yeah, talking like, I feel like we've said set up so much within the past time we've been recording, but it's true. Like the first episode is a lot of, and like you can do setup poorly and you can do setup greatly, and this is one of those episodes that did set up very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
When we're in that Fire Navy ship with Aang and Katara, like Katara is visibly worried, like she doesn't want to be there. She's like telling Aang about all these things about like why it's like a bad memory for like her tribe and stuff like that. And then we have Aang who's like blissfully ignorant about what happened because he's been gone for so long.
Yeah, and it does this like, and again, like it allows the story to also have this moment to tell us like kind of the I guess you could say like a child's disbelief and everything. In addition to that, like again, it
That kind of
furthers,
childlike wonder.
yeah, like that it sets it up because what's really interesting about that scene too, now that I'm actually thinking about it, is that Katara's voice is the initial narration, and then of course we learn throughout the episode that like, oh, Katara was telling us this story, right? So it already has kind of established her character as like, oh, she's very like aware of like the history, and she's educated herself about it, which is cool. We love an educated woman. In addition to that, like what's so dope about the shipwreck scene, because I guess throughout the episode when after Katara saves Aang, they eventually go adventuring, and what have you, some shenanigans throughout the village. Aang and Katara kind of go away during their penguin sledding to actually talk about like, oh hey, there's a Fire Navy ship, let's go here. And of course, what I love about this dynamic now is again, you have like the the Avatar kid who's like fresh out of the iceberg, and he's like whoa, the world, what is going on? And just imagine being in his shoes, like, oh, and you're stepping into a warship for the first time, where like, it's like, wait, the Fire Nation has warships where people are being hurt, and of course Katara's like, oh yeah, this is like a bad omen to our tribe. And I always love that wording too, like, this isn't like, oh, this is just a bad ship in a bad place. Like they like they use these big words like, oh, like it was like a bad omen or something like that.
I think, yeah, it was either like a bad omen. She said like this is a scar on my tribe or something. Something about like a haunting memory. I think I'm paraphrasing, but I think
Yeah.
she said something along those lines.
Yeah, but like the fact that we, just from our like little interaction here, like the episode set up that weight again, and everything is all supplemented by that initial narration. And I love that, like, for those of us who have seen the series, we know that the narration always comes up at the very beginning. Shame on you if you skip it. Why? Why would you do that?
They made it shorter in Korra, but that's besides the point.
Yeah, like the thing is, it's like every like it's one of those things where it's like I loved it because it was that consistent reminder that like everything that they're doing is happening because of all of these events that happen. They're dealing with this, and they're kind of like, and we'll go into this later, but I think we can even dedicate a day, an hour to just talking about the idea of intergenerational trauma, because like intergenerational trauma here, I guess to a very, very quick definition. So is basically like trauma that comes on from like your ancestors before you, but it's interesting how it's seen here because it's kind of like the ancestors, but of as like a bender in general. Like if you're an earth bender, like you're dealing with the trauma that not just like your direct family and your direct like blood related ancestors go through, but like literally your entire nation like of the Earth Kingdom went through.
Like the Earth Kingdom's huge.
Yeah, and like again dealing like with that thing, And then of course there's like the Fire Nation, because there's there was trauma that was like unraveled there. Um, damn it, I love this show.
It's a really good show. There's a lot of things to talk about, but just
Hmm.
sticking. There's so many things that we want to talk about and want to continue talking about, but sticking to episode one is so hard because we want to keep going and want to keep telling us
Yeah,
the
we
story, but
do.
it's just you know, there's only so much you can say about the first episode, especially because it's the first episode of the first season. But it does
Yes.
give you a bunch of amazing. It makes you care about these characters almost immediately. You
Hmm.
fall in love with like Aang's childlike wonder and his very blissful ignorance of what's going on because you as the viewer already have an idea of what's going on. You know, we also meet Zuko and Iroh for the first time in little chunks throughout this episode, and we see Zuko just being mad and furious as he always is. In the early seasons.
Yeah, and I love too that like when with the introduction of Zuko and Iroh too. The little fun tidbit. I will have to fact check this for a future episode, but I remember some like hearing somewhere that Iroh's character originally was just meant to be like the fun-loving joke, like character where he was just there for more comedic relief. But
Oh,
obviously,
really?
yeah, as we know, he is completely not that
Huh.
at all. But that was the original intention. But of course, this was more of like probably maybe like after the first season they decided, hey, Iroh's a better character. I will look into it, for sure. But what's interesting too about what the episode does in terms of setting up is we actually kind of humanize the Fire Nation a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
because it happens for a brief moment, but when we get the glimpses of the Fire Nation, we just see Zuko basically training in combat against the Avatar. But what I love about his training sessions is that whenever he's fighting, Iroh never makes it a point to push his to correct him based off of, oh, you should be fighting as if you're fighting the Avatar. Right now, that's Zuko's mindset. Prepare my
Mm.
combat ability so I can beat the ever loving shit out of a fucking 12-year-old. Like thinking about it, holy crap.
Well, also
Um,
at the time he doesn't think that Aang's 12 years old. He thinks that he's 112.
yeah, actually the ending line is like, so he's pretty agile for an old man. Like,
Oh yeah, that was a really good Zuko.
thank you. I've been practicing. I love Dante Bosco so much. Anyways, um, but yeah, no. What I also love about Iroh's like real quick instruction to Zuko was that he said the fire comes from the breath. You shouldn't be like, it's not from the muscle, it's not from physical strength, it comes from like emotion. But what I love about that again is, even though it isn't saying much in terms of, like, because Iroh isn't basically wagging his finger saying don't fight as if you're fighting a person, fight from within, whatever, like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of like it's introduced in this very natural way of just like, your firebending is your breathing. It's very much tied to this sense of inner self. And like, yeah, like even like the original Avatar, I know that Korra kind of delves into spirituality a bit more, and I honestly have opinions about that. But
Yeah, they work fundamentally different in Korra.
yeah, but here it was already kind of again that fledgling little thing of like, yeah, bending is more than just like a physical power in this universe. It's not just like a means to overwhelm your opponent. There's a bending gets empowered the more that you personally understand your own self. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just learning about techniques or doing workouts. It's about like, I don't know, that whole idea of breathing, but you breathe fire. Like, holy shit.
Yeah.
But yeah, woo. But yeah,
All
that's
right.
basically like episode one.
That's basically episode one. I want to take this time to tell our audience if you haven't or if you have the ability to, please take an ethnic studies course.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Absolutely. We are actually two of us, both of us are teachers. We teach with an amazing, fantastic program called the Pinoy Pinay Educational Partnerships based in San Francisco, California, where at least for the two of us, we teach middle school, we teach eighth grade, but we do teach from kindergarten all the way up until community college in a pipeline. But basically, what we do is we teach Filipino American studies, and we try to um, make our education relevant while building relationships with our students. Um, and one way that we try to make things relevant is trying to find things that are like modern and that like relate, you know. And this is one of the things that's been in the back of both of our heads. Like we both love Avatar. Both of us are huge fans of not only the series but also just a bunch of different TV shows as well. And we were like, well, why don't we like make something and relate it to like ethnic studies, you know. And we chose Avatar to be the first one because we thought it would be a little bit easier on our end, especially with such a huge connection to it in our childhood, you know.
Mm-hmm. Big time. And yeah, thank you for bringing that up, JR. So yeah, like we're not just doing this out of like a we're actually like we are doing this because we are very much we keep our childhood experiences close to heart, and that we start to kind of see how they've basically like, influenced and inspired us to kind of be where we're at today, type of thing. So yeah, so yeah, like I think what I'm gonna leave our audience with now is for those of you who are listening who are part of PEP, what's up? It's JR and Paolo. What's up,
What it
y'all?
do?
But yeah, we're going to obviously have a bit more structure to this in the future. Thank y'all for your patience with us, and for just tuning in, even if it was for like a couple of minutes. We plan to do more of these on a more scheduled basis, based on our life schedules. But it is simply going to be like this hour where we will fill time. And hey, maybe if any of y'all have questions about this episode, maybe again depending on how y'all feel about it, throw a question in the comments or something, and we will answer like a couple of them before we like
Moving
dissect
to the next
episode 2.
episode. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. That
All right.
concludes episode of 1 of whatever we're going to be calling this.
Yeah. I called it Yip Yap, but I don't know. We'll think about something. All right. Cool.
All
Thank
right.
y'all.
Thank you everyone for watching. We
Thanks
will
for
see you
watching.
in the next video. Peace.